Hi, today we'll do a tree case study using this black pine as an example. As with prior videos, our method of approach is the same. We consider the health of the tree, which determines the extent it can receive work, then the technique to produce a reaction or branch quality that is desirable to bonsai. Last, of course, is our aesthetic discretion, which is relative to the individual tree and your goals. Specifically, we'll discuss the concept of decandling and balancing a pine as a means of producing finer and subsequent smaller growth. On this pine, we can observe individual strong shoots that have elongated on the top, while shoots on the bottom and the inside with minimal new growth in comparison. I will walk you through my thought process, branch by branch, as we evaluate this pine and the work needed to further its development. So again, looking at this tree, we have a variable growing condition. And kind of what I mean by that is we have individual shoots on the top, right, which are a bit stronger. You can see there's more abundance of foliage. This shoot's a bit longer. We have parts here that are real stunted, didn't grow at all, and pieces on the bottom that are in a similar scenario. And so the strategy on working on this tree is first to balance it, right? So we can match the relative strength of the strongest and the weakest regions of the tree, and in doing so, allow the tree to grow back in with more uniformity as well as more density. I've kind of discussed in the past video of this idea of size scale, and it becomes even more critical on a smaller tree like this Shohin sized cascade pine. As the tree gets smaller and smaller, there's some kind of assumption for us to proportionally shrink everything that goes along with it, right? So the branches have to shrink to match, which means the technique needs to get more precise. We kind of scale things down, so even like this little tree maintains that impact of feeling as if it was a larger tree. And so to kind of preface, I'll talk a little bit about what decandling is. And so I've got this donor branch. I've just cut off another tree, and we can see there's two stages of growth on this, right? You can see these kind of slightly lighter green lower needles towards the base of the tree or this branch, and this longer extension coming above it, and the needles are a bit darker on it as well. And so what we're looking at here are two generations of growth. There is this growth from last year, right? All these needles emerged last spring, and there was a bud here, right, in kind of the winter springtime, and that bud elongated over these, say, 5-month period, right? Maybe around March through now. And this new bud, which elongated, and now it's this kind of like new, nice and strong shoot, we call this the candle in bonsai. We call it a candle because the shape, it's, I guess, somewhat similar, representative of a candle. There's like a straight stalk and kind of hard to see, but there's this kind of pointed bud in the middle of the crown. So it just ended up being called as a candle. Kind of moving forward though, the basic strategy in kind of developing this tree, give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. So the basic strategy, right, in developing specifically black pines is that we can decandle, which means we remove the entirety of this new shoot right at the base of where the old needles emerge, right? We can cut this, and on a healthy tree, in a tree that is strong and balanced at this cut site, new summer buds will emerge, and essentially they'll produce multiples of the same shoot, but they come out subsequently smaller. And so that's how we can go from, say, like one really strong shoot and breaking it down to 2, 4, so forth. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's just a means for us to compact a tree and to grow it more refined, right? Achieving this sense of size scale. And so this is kind of the basic idea, right? But there's a little bit more kind of a nuance to that, which I'll discuss next. Back on track, there are some limitations to this work. For example, if the shoot is not very strong and as I just did, cut that terminal shoot on the end, it's not guaranteed that we get a production of these summer buds and the subsequent branch could die. Some better examples is, again, going back to this tree, we notice that there is a variable branch condition. Some tips are further along and more elongated. Some haven't grown at all down in the inside, and ones kind of lower on the tree are fairly small, right, on the short side. And so we know the relative difference in strength is not the same. And so if I just went in here and just started cutting all the shoots as they are, the tree perhaps would not die, but not every branch would respond favorably. So some on the top that are stronger may grow, weaker ones could die back, medium strength ones could stall out. And so there's a bit more complexity to how we approach pines, but the work in itself, right, is not that complicated. We're taking small decisions and extrapolating them over every single branch, right? It just comes down to this fundamental basis of balancing a tree. How can we distribute the strength and the energy? Another thing to think about is this idea of needle pulling or needle thinning. And so say we have this branch, right, which I've just cut off on the tree, and there's still all these residual needles left. And these needles play a role in the tree a little bit more than just providing strength. Certainly we need these needles. After we cut off the branch, it helps sustain it, right? So the new summer buds, the candle, after we cut off the candle, the new summer buds can emerge. There's another concept that we can consider for these needles. So in trees, and this is a bit of a generalization, but we can say there must be some kind of feedback that tells the tree when it should grow more and perhaps when it should grow less. Maybe it could equate to a strong part of the tree that's growing faster, elongating more. It makes sense for the tree to allocate strength to that, right? It's kind of this expenditure of energy efficiently. And whereas, say, branches which are not doing so well or shaded out, there must be some input for those not to grow. And this kind of, I guess you can say, like signal indicating for that given branch to grow more is through a hormone called auxin. And so the growing tips on a tree produce auxin, and it's like this kind of feedback cycle signaling to the plant to allocate more resources and generate more growth. But something to note about the hormone auxin, right, which is present on our foliage and on the ends of the tree, they also act as an inhibitor for branches behind it. So let's say this branch here has a lot of foliage, a lot of needles coming out of it. Even though we've just cut off this candle for the purpose of generating new growth, this abundance of foliage and needles signal to the tree that, hey, this branch is doing not bad. We still have a lot of energy, a lot of resources here. Maybe it's not in our best interest to allocate strength to grow these buds, right? There is some delay, as you can say, that because of the hormones present in these existing needles, that the onset of these summer buds may not be so fast. And there's this additional concept in not only how we cut these candles, but by pulling needles where we can kind of adjust this hormonal balance of the tree, you can say, where I want the tree not only in terms of strength, right, but the relative needle density to be similar, because all that means is that different parts of the tree are going to share this same feedback signaling via the auxin, and it allows these summer buds to mature more uniformly. And so, kind of again, going back to the main tree, all this means is that as I select these new shoots to cut, I have to be mindful that I'm balancing the density as well, right? So it comes down to pulling and thinning needles in regions that are perhaps fuller, stronger, more dense. And so not only in terms of the strength, but we kind of have this via the tree's natural feedback system, right? This innate sense of balance, it can determine to allocate strength more uniformly. Now, there's some limitations to this, right? So if I just started thinking, well, okay, on the other extreme end, I was like, too many needles is bad, right? I have to pull the needles really aggressively so it thins it out and I don't have an inhibitor, right? So it kind of makes sense what I was talking about. But if I go too aggressive and I start thinking, okay, these needles are gonna prevent the new shoot from coming out, and say I pluck this down real aggressive, maybe almost to no needles, right? You could go across this point of no return where although I've removed, right, say inhibitors for allocating new growth, the presence of the foliage here is still providing a role in giving this branch strength. And so I have to be mindful where I just don't go and start removing all the foliage off the tree. This is different than, say, deciduous trees, things like maples and elms, where seasonally it may be appropriate to cut off all the foliage. On a conifer, right, such as a pine, a juniper, cedar, cypress, things of that nature. If you remove too much of the foliage, it will severely weaken the tree, right? The strength is determined by the amount of foliage present on the tree, and so I do need to be mindful that I'm not working it too aggressively. Whereas you can see on some deciduous trees during the growing season, if the tree is strong, I may remove every single leaf on that tree to forcibly generate a new growth cycle. Although in a sense, we're doing that on this pine by cutting the candle of the remaining needles, I have to be mindful and cautious, right? So the thinning is important, and we have to consider the relative density and strength, but you can't go too crazy and pluck everything off. So what I'm gonna do with this pine is I'll walk you through my thought process, right? On a tree that is, say, not necessarily balanced real well, not necessarily growing in a optimal uniform condition, there's quite a lot of variation on this tree. And so I'll walk you through kind of a bud by bud scenario where what am I thinking when I'm deciding what to cut and the implications of that. And again, right, it seems very complicated on the surface, but when you start stitching together all these small pieces of information, right, it becomes much more logical and intuitive. Okay, so hope you guys can get a good idea of what's kind of going on here. On the top, I've got these old needles on the tree. These are actually some second-year needles. So 2 generations ago, I'll kind of pluck, maybe cut some of these out. This tree is real light. It's hard for me to pull it. And I'm gonna take out some of these second-year needles first, just to thin out these crowded spots. Now these buds here, we can see the new growth this year didn't really elongate, and so these shoots are too weak to be decandling. I will just lightly thin some of these old needles. Okay, kind of moving on this next branch. Again, kind of same thing. Normally I would pluck this out, but you can see this tree is a little light. When I pull this, it's kind of teetering the tree. So I'll just be a bit more careful and cut them instead. So taking out these kind of old second-year needles, and then now on this shoot I can see the crown right here. This is the needles last year and the candle that's produced in the center. These shoots are a bit stronger, so I'm gonna go ahead and decandle this to match the strength on the surrounding shoots and just very lightly reduce the needle density of this tip. We'll kind of go ahead and do that on this one as well. This one here seems a little bit too stunted, so we'll leave that one alone. A similar situation here. See this bud, it barely elongated real tight. I'm just gonna cut some of the old needles around it. We'll leave that one alone. We have this stronger candle here. I'm gonna go ahead and make the cut. Again, reducing the overall needle density. I'm trying to match this to the weaker parts of the tree. And I'll kind of do all these top branches first. So these stronger candles, no problem to just go ahead and cut them. This one right here seems to be not bad in terms of strength, not quite as big as the other ones. And so what I'll do is that I'll still cut this, but I'm not going to remove any of the needles attached to it. Right, a strong one like this one here, I can go ahead and cut that, cut it a little cleaner, and then I'm going to go ahead and take off both the second year needles around it. Gotta work around the camera a little bit here and get this one cleaned up as well. Okay, just continuing the work. Just bear with me a bit. I'm trying to navigate this around the camera and do the work while providing a good vantage point. So it may seem a bit clumsy at times. Okay, so going in deeper in the canopy, I have these buds here, and these buds didn't really elongate, but the good thing, they are growing, right? It just means I don't want to cut them. I can lightly thin out this area with some of these old, actually on some of these is not only last year's needles, but some second year needles as well. And so I do need to take those out to open up the density. On those second year needles, really what it is, they're just two kind of bandings or collars down from the candle that you can see these kind of iterations of needle sets. It's kind of important to remove those really old needles because while they may provide some resources for the tree, they're no longer as efficient as, say, the newer growth on the tree. And so keeping them, right, we talked earlier about how the foliage will produce some levels of auxins. The tree thinks like, hey, this branch is still pretty dense. Maybe it's not so urgent. I immediately put new growth here, but it's delaying that onset of new growth while retaining weaker foliage. I want to kind of force the flush of new growth all in the same cycle and have it come out more uniform. And so that kind of older growth is not real beneficial, right? It's not as photosynthetically efficient as the newer branch on the tree, and on top of that, the relative density is inhibiting the new shoot from coming out. So if I see those, I will remove them as I go. A little stronger candle up there, I'll go ahead and cut that, remove some of these old needles as well. And so kind of the strategy to cut pines efficiently, right? You use a tweezer in one hand, scissors in the other. I'm left-handed, so actually I use my tweezers in my right hand for more dexterity, controlling the shoot, and I use the scissors in my off hand. Because for the sake of the camera and the video, I can't actually grab the shoots in the right positions, so you'll see me randomly swap tools to different hands, but the default is usually for me left-handed, tweezers in dominant hand, scissors in opposite hand. If you're right-handed, it's vice versa. So again, these shoots here, right? Yeah, a little bit on the stunted side. So I'm kind of more apprehensive to decandle that. So I will just thin the needles in this area. And so originally I didn't anticipate that I would be decandling this tree at all this year. Actually, it was quite weak looking in the early part of the year. And so I kind of watched it very carefully, try to manage the water, increase fertilizing, and fortunately the tree's come around. It's looking pretty healthy now. But again, we never want to force this work. And so a common theme I'll reiterate on this channel is that technique alone is not good enough, right? If we learn some kind of technique or skill and we apply it without consideration and context, I mean, you can have very detrimental results, right? We need to be conscientious, understand the role of the work that we're doing, and basically how it affects the health of the tree, right? We have to be very conscientious about that. And so these stronger candles, I cut them and I'm quote unquote pulling, but again, doing it with scissors because this tree's on the light side, removing these old needles. And again, I'm kind of just matching this density. I'm actually going to turn this tree around and let me verify the focus. Okay, kind of again, stronger candles. Oop, a little tipsy there. You guys kind of see what I mean. Gotta be a bit more careful. This is a client tree, not my own. So kind of again on these weaker shoots that didn't elongate real well, I feel it's a bit too aggressive for me to decandle it, especially knowing that it was stressed before, and so I'm just thinning the needles in those regions. You can say, well, if this tree was stressed, why do anything at all? The dilemma, especially for a small tree, is that these uncut tips will grow longer and thicker. It increases the size scale, makes the branches more coarse, and while these tips gather strength, right, my low branches will get really weak. Remember how I talked about the growth on the tree produces auxins? It's an indicator for the tree to allocate resources to that branch, but for those lateral and lower and adjacent branches, it's an inhibitor. So the strong parts again will get stronger and the weak parts get weaker. And so I have to kind of assess that, well, maybe if I didn't do anything at all, the tree as a whole ultimately will be stronger. What is that kind of trade-off and detriment? Say if the tree just happened to grow much more uniformly and balanced and was, say, about the same strength, I can make an argument that be like, hey, this tree was a little stressed last year, let me skip decandling. But because the shoots are still somewhat compact and balanced, I am less concerned that the tree will become leggy, right? That's an option as well. Not quite the case on this tree, right? And so I have to be a bit more mindful in this work. The growth condition again is a bit variable. I'm kind of case by case deciding whether I can cut the shoot or not, and needing to do a lot of thinning, which just meant that these real old needles on the tree, which should have been cleaned out a year ago, was not done, right? So I'm kind of pulling these old needles, second year needle. Again, I say pulling, right? But I'm using my scissors, but it's just the kind of technique of what I'm doing. Typically, I would pull them, right? Okay, so kind of back in business. Again, going after some of these stronger candles. Ones that seem a bit stunted, small, or weak, I'm just going to thin the needles out in the periphery and just opt not to cut it. So this tree is kind of like, maybe not as intuitive and straightforward. I mean, there's simple decision making in terms of I'm like matching the density and matching the strength, but you definitely need to assess these things, right? You don't want to rush through the work and just start brute forcing the cuts, not giving the tree due consideration, and that's when you can have negative outcomes. But it just also means that a tree that's not kept consistently healthy, there's setbacks, right? And the tree gets weak, not maintained real well, the work gets more complicated because the balance of the tree gets more and more off the mark. And then, which of course it can be fixed, right? But there's just more considerations we have to give. So I'm basically just sharing my thought process on, when I'm working on trees, which inevitably, right, say you're doing bonsai professionally, you'll see a very wide array of trees within your clients, right? The condition can be any condition. And so for me, it's especially pertinent to assess, right, how the tree's growing and the strength, balance, and differences in the branches. A failure to do that could result in branches dying back and not responding favorably. So it's kind of important, right, for me to assess the growing condition of a tree, right? And so we can do work precisely but also very considerate, right? When we work on bonsai, realistically, many of these trees will outlive us, and often you can work on trees that perhaps wasn't started by yourself, right? Could have been started decades ago by another practitioner and enthusiast. And there's some gesture of respect, right, to this time value, something that maybe you can't always produce on your own, right? It's the collective effort of many years and people. And so you want to be a bit diligent and careful on the old trees. Okay, had to readjust the tree and camera. So again, kind of working my way through the tree. Here's some stronger ones that I missed earlier. I'm gonna go ahead and cut that and also remove these old second year needles on the tree. Right, and these kind of lower inside branches, actually I don't want to decandle these, right? They didn't do that well. I'm just going to thin them out by removing the old needles. Again, just trying to match the density of everything. Okay, kind of rotate a bit, check that focus. All right, so again, on these lower branches, not strong enough to be decandled. So I'm just going to thin them out, have the tree allocated strength on the new growth, and encourage elongation of the regions I cut. Right, I'm balancing the tree and removing inhibitors that are perhaps delaying the elongation of other branching. Again, doing this mindfully. I can't just forcefully remove the majority of the foliage, right? Could have some negative effects. It's kind of maybe hard to tell, but this branch in here, this branch looks like it was cut last year and it didn't produce a bud, right? We see there's just this cut mark, but there's no shoot coming out of this branch. If you guys can kind of see what I'm grabbing right here. And so that's a sign that just shows if you cut branches while the tree's not healthy, and perhaps this was a weaker and it's an interior branch on the tree, and if you cut things, right, not considering the overall strength, health, and balance, right, there's a negative outcome, right? There's a chance that branch will just die. Sometimes you're lucky, and these kind of branches that didn't form a bud, it still may generate a shoot later, but it's just kind of a sign that the branch is on the weak side and got cut too hard last year. So again, a lot of these low branches not strong enough for decandling. I'm just thinning out some of these old needles just to match the relative density. So more or less on all these low branches, I'm doing that. But the good sign again is that despite the stressors that this tree may have experienced last year, the bud tips are still alive and they're still attempting to grow, even if it's growing a bit on the small side. Kind of pivot over a little bit here. Okay, so these candles here, again, real stunted and small. So it's not a great condition to cut them. I'll just go ahead and thin out these older needles just to match the density and encourage some elongation, right? Getting absolutely demolished by mosquitoes while I am recording this. I have this candles here on this low branch that's actually somewhat strong. These shoots are a bit more outward facing. There's exposure to sun here. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and cut these, right? Because these kind of inner shoots will get weaker if I don't. And again, because it's this kind of lower, not as dense branch relative to the top, I will adjust for that or accommodate that by not quite cutting or quote unquote pulling these old needles out, right? I just do it to a lesser degree. We can tell these small ones, which were cut maybe last year, they're real stunted, but they're buds on it. So let me kind of bring you guys in closer, and we can catch a bit of this perspective here. So we can see all these little branches here, right? There's no real evident kind of like green stalk that I talked about, but on the very tip, right, there is a definite bud. And so it shows these branches were weak, but they will grow. And so if I do this thinning and balancing work now, I can expect the shoot to elongate later. And so again, just need to be just mindful and aware and kind of just checking this variable growth condition as I work my way through the tree. Okay, so here's the tree after this kind of initial round of work. And what we've done here again is the stronger candles on the top, right? There is these longer shoots. I went ahead and cut them and reduced the density of those last year needles a little bit. I noticed on this tree that there is a lot of second needles still left, right? So it's kind of two banding, two collars down. I went ahead and basically removed all of the second year needles, and then these kind of middle region and interior branches where the candle was quite stunted, didn't really elongate. I just thinned some of last year's needles a little bit, but I kept, as you can kind of see here, these smaller shoots intact, right? If I cut these smaller candles, there's a chance that the bud may not mature, the branch could die back, or it just gets delayed. And actually we can see that must have happened to this tree last year, because if we look at some of these lower branches, we can tell it almost didn't elongate at all, but definitely there is a bud. I don't know if you guys can see right in the middle, there's a bud there. So that was a branch that probably was attempted cut last year, but maybe the tree was not healthy, it was not balanced, and as a result, it wasn't able to elongate the candle as we see right now, and just kind of got stunted. Then 1 year and season later, it's able to grow again. And so those branches, if I cut them, it'll definitely die. And so those areas, I just lightly thinned it and overall just left it alone. And so this tree is maybe not the best example to use for decandling because the technique is not so straightforward, right? It's not just like snip, snip, and everything's good to go. There's a lot of variables at play. But I thought for that reason, this is a good tree to perhaps like teach some of the thought process and considerations that go into bonsai work, just so we can begin to be more precise in our practice. And so kind of going forward on this tree, all these small shoots, right, now that we've cut them, they have better ability to elongate. Well, I mean the uncut ones around the periphery of the stronger shoots, and the ones that were strong should be capable of forming a summer bud. And so we matched this relative balance, and over the course of this remainder 3-4 months of growing season, I can expect the rest of these shoots to fill in, right? So this will grow in more uniformly, more dense, and then at the end of the year, and we can revisit this tree then, I'll pluck the needles again to kind of pull off what we see now. They'll become the old needles, right? Because new shoots will come out, and I can match the density and balance the tree entering next year's growth cycle.
Okay, so that's all I have for you today. If there's one key takeaway you can draw from this, it is to look at bonsai with greater consideration. If we apply techniques with a broad brushstroke, you'll find it difficult to develop trees to higher refinement levels. I hope you find the information informative, and I would appreciate it if you subscribed and shared this video. Thank you again.